Hi sewing friends, welcome to my sewing room. My name is Beth, and if you're new, welcome. Behind me I have a quilt that I made over 15 years ago for my 10-year-old son at the time. I used a lot of scraps, I did some foundation piecing, and the main question today is, can I save this quilt? The edges are worn, the binding is worn out, and he would like to continue using it. He lives independently he's got some special needs, so he lives with support in a home, and they don't always wash things the way I would wash them. And I believe this quilt has had some bleach, but it's still surviving except for the binding. So I'm going to go back, I'm going to add a new binding to this old quilt. It is not an heirloom quilt by any means, but he still loves using it, and that makes me happy. So I'm going to show you today how I'm going to try to save this old quilt. Let's get started. Here you can see this old binding is all worn out. The rest of the quilt seemed to be okay, but the binding was definitely worn. So I found some blue fabric very similar to what this old quilt has already on it, and I cut some 2.5-inch strips, enough to go all the way around. After getting all my strips cut, I put each of the ends of the pieces sort of at a 90-degree angle, and then I stitched from corner to corner, and then I trimmed off the excess triangle. Typically, I press my binding in half, but since this quilt already has a pretty thick binding on it, except for what's worn there, I didn't want the edge of this quilt to be super thick, so I folded the end of that 2.5-inch strip, and I started sewing, and I'm going to sew all the way around. This is going to be a single layer of fabric covering this worn out binding. When I got to the corner, I stopped, and then I stitched off at an angle, and then I folded just like I always do when I have a folded binding. I just did the same thing. I folded up, and then I pulled the binding straight up, and then I folded it straight down, and then I'll start sewing at the top of that fold. Now I am kind of adding this binding sort of on top of the previous binding, and I'm going to go all the way around my quilt. When I got to the end, I just laid the end of that binding over the fold. I finished stitching, and then all of my raw edges will be inside. All I need to do then is roll the binding to the right side. I'll tuck the edges in and I will top stitch all the way around. Here's some blue thread that matches my binding, and I don't think I've mentioned yet that this quilt, since it was made so long ago, it was probably one of the first big quilts that I free motion quilted, and you can tell those funny stitches I put in there look kind of funny, but actually they work, and my son really appreciates the quilt and probably has no idea that those free motion quilting lines are very beginner looking, but you know what, it works. And there I even tried to write his name with my machine, which was kind of fun. Well, this is a quilt that really wanted to be saved. I know if we didn't have any sentimental value, it would not have been saved, but that little bit of binding fixed up this quilt in no time, and I can give it back to my son, and it will continue to be loved. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.